There was a time when from one end of the continent to the other, the animals of Africa roamed freely. Humans had little effect on their movements or numbers. When game populations grew too large, pandemic diseases ravaged the land, decimating the herds, denuding vast tracts of many forms of animal life. In the modern era, with hugely expanded human populations now a major factor in the fortunes of wildlife, with diseases controlled by modern science, and with wild animals restricted to finite sanctuaries, the survival of wildlife in Africa is entirely dependent on management by man. Your host is Ron Thompson, an internationally renowned conservationist with extensive elephant management experience. The story he is about to tell you about the management needs of Africa's elephants is bold, dramatic, tragic.
At an international convention held in Switzerland in 1989, following intense social and political pressures by British, American, and European animal rights groups, the African elephant across the length and breadth of the continent was declared to be an endangered species. Many elephant management experts protested that absolute protection was not in the best interests of the African elephant. Now, as a result of the elephant's new legal status, many elephant populations, once totally safe, are now truly endangered. Wildlife authorities have many elephant management options, so they have choices to make. But they must be prepared to bear the consequences of their preference, for when it comes to wildlife, society is forever critical. Whatever the rights or wrongs of this, if the man in the street really wishes to influence wildlife management decisions, he must be prepared to make the effort to keep himself informed. I recently undertook a journey across Africa to film elephants in their habitats, in 8 wildlife sanctuaries and in 4 countries. We shall now use this material to illustrate the real management needs of the African elephant in modern game reserve national parks. You may not like what you're about to see and hear, but it is fact. All we ask is that you keep an open mind. I have been used to this kind of scene all my life, but it worries me now that ours may be the last generation to enjoy this kind of spectacle. And strange as though it may seem, the manner in which we manage our elephant populations will determine whether our grandchildren inherit this kind of natural magnificence.
In historical times, there were few places in sub-Saharan Africa where elephants were not found. In the last 300 years, however, elephants have decreased in number as human populations have increased.
A popular misconception is that elephants migrate from one end of Africa to the other. They do not, and they never have. Elephants have always lived out their lives in relatively small areas.
During the dry season, elephants concentrate on sources of permanent water, such as a river. Daily, they move away from the river to seek food, and they return each evening to drink. It is important to understand that the number of elephants that this dry season bottleneck range can sustainably carry determines the number of elephants that the game reserve as a whole can carry throughout the year, no matter how big the wet season range may be. When the rains come, the elephants disperse to take advantage of the green grass and foliage that emerges after the very first rainstorms. Throughout the 6-month-long wet season, they drink from temporary ponds and streams away from the river, giving the riverine vegetation time to recover from the concentrated dry season feeding activities of the herds. At this time of the year, the elephants wander freely. Annually, therefore, the herds pulse out from and back towards the river, depending on the season of the year.
When human settlements are established in elephant habitats, the elephants, especially the breeding herds, begin to shun their former ranges at about the time human numbers exceed 40 people per square mile. When a human settlement of such proportions is established on one side of a river in an elephant habitat, for example, the animal's annual dispersion pattern is very seriously affected. This means that elephant-proof fences are not necessary to confine elephants. For in the face of expanding human populations, the elephants will confine themselves into smaller and smaller areas. Essentially, what we have described here is the seasonal movement of one population of elephants. It's important to understand this population dimension, for it has vital implications in the proper management of the elephant as a species. Today, we can count elephant populations in terms of the numbers of game reserves that carry elephant herds.
The implications of this fact are enormous. For example, if the elephant population of Namibia's Etosha National Park was to be wiped out by poachers, that fact would have no impact whatsoever on any other elephant population anywhere else on the continent of Africa.
Problems that face any one population, therefore, are peculiar to that population. They can only be solved by applying specific management strategies that are designed to solve those problems and in that population. Elephants cannot be managed as a species. The declaration of the African elephant to be an endangered species in 1989, just because East African populations of elephants were being decimated by poachers, is a mockery. It is tantamount to saying that because there is drought in India, the people of New York City in America must go on water rationing.
A breeding herd of elephants comprises several units of cows and their dependent offspring. Herds are normally led by an old matriarch, who is probably the mother of the principal cows in the group. Sometimes breeding herds join together to form a vast meta-group of elephants. Bulls live well away from the breeding herds, which are noisy and fussy, preferring to lead a quiet and sedate life in solitary splendor, or in small bachelor herds, or sometimes in very large herds, like this group of 103 in Namibia's Mahangu Game Reserve. Some areas are taken over by the bulls. They become bull areas in which no females live at all. Whereas, however, cow herds will vacate habitats invaded by human settlements, the bulls will continue to visit such settlements at night, raiding the ripening crops, even entering the villages to push down the grain storage huts to get at the harvested food within. When the crops are ripening, the whole village is kept awake night after night, the people spending their time beating drums and rattling tin cans to keep the big animals out of their crops. And so, whereas the people in the developed world may look upon the African elephant as a priceless world heritage, most African villagers view them as valueless liabilities.
The people cannot legally hunt an elephant. They're sent to jail if they kill one. They gain no material benefits from the presence of elephants in their settlement areas. The elephants raid their crops and their grain bins, and villagers are sometimes killed by them. The people also covet the protected land on which the elephants now live, and from which their fathers not so long ago were evicted to permit the establishment of the national parks. Now the people consider the game reserves to be nothing more than playgrounds for foreign visitors, from whom they obtain no benefits at all. It was a very easy step, therefore, for the people of Africa to take up the AK-47 rifles, obtained from many of Africa's liberation wars, and to begin supplying the black market with ivory.
Elephants prefer to eat grass. During the rains, when the grass is tall, sweet and nutritious, they eat practically nothing else. As the dry season advances, however, and the grasses dry out, so the elephants turn to eating the green leaves of woody plants and the bark of trees. At the height of the dry season, they eat practically nothing else but the leaves and the bark of trees. Now, try to visualize a small population of elephants living in a stable and healthy habitat. When the elephants are low in number, their feeding has little effect on the habitats. And because their food supply is abundant, the herds grow at the maximum rate, about 7% per annum. This means the population will double its numbers in just 10 years. In the beginning, even the loss of a single breeding female will be a setback. But as the population grows, such losses become less and less important, and soon the population growth surges. The surge phase occurs because there are, each year, more and more breeding females entering the population, and because the nutrition levels are high, encouraging the maximum production of calves. At this time, the habitat is still healthy. Annual productivity during the surge phase is much greater than during any other phase of the population growth pattern. When feeding on woody vegetation, elephants prefer to feed at ground level and on the understory plants in a woodland, causing very little damage to the top canopy trees. But when woodlands begin to change from this, where the understory is healthy, to this, where all the understory plants have been removed, trouble can be expected. For then, the animals have no option but to start breaking down the bigger trees to get at their leaves, to eat their roots, and to strip the bark from the tree trunks. The bulls do the most damage. Being much bigger and stronger than the cows, they are able to push over much bigger trees, and they debark much bigger trees too. The females and their young contribute towards woodland destruction by removing the seedlings and saplings from the understories. In years gone by, elephants dispersed from habitats in which they could no longer obtain their preferred dry season foods. They moved to other localities where understory plants were more readily available. Populations stabilized naturally at a level that was consistent with the carrying capacities of their habitats.
Unfortunately, few such natural ecosystems occur today. Most modern elephant sanctuaries are either surrounded by intense human developments or by elephant-proof fences. This means that the elephants cannot or they will not disperse. Instead, they increase annually at the expense of their own habitats, and most damage occurs at the height of the dry season, which I call the environmental bottleneck. Now, what we have to understand about this is that no matter how big your game reserve may be, the numbers of elephants that that game reserve can hold annually is determined by the numbers of elephants that the habitats can hold sustainably during this environmental bottleneck period.
When the population exceeds the habitat's carrying capacity, the habitat can no longer replace the vegetation which the elephants eat each dry season. So each year, as the elephant numbers increase, the food resources become progressively less and less. Eventually, the quantity of edible plants becomes so depleted and their nutritional value becomes so poor, the habitat can no longer support the rate of increase of the elephant population. A stress point is therefore reached when the population's growth first falters, then ceases. The first animals to suffer are the very small calves because their mother's milk dries up. The starving babies suffer from many kinds of nutritional deficiency diseases, like human beriberi. Eventually, they're abandoned by their mothers. The first signs of an elephant population in distress, therefore, are abandoned calves and evidence of excessive calf mortality. This syndrome was already well advanced in Zimbabwe's Garcia National Park when we filmed there in October 1992. At that time, the authorities were busy rescuing baby elephants from death by starvation. These are 3-year-old weaned calves, the smallest sized calves in the Garcia elephant herds at that time. All the current year's baby calves had already died. So had the 1-year-old calves and the 2-year-olds. After the babies, the younger juveniles and the older cows die. Then the very old bulls and other infirm adults also die. Eventually, their food base reduced to nothing, whole herds waste away.
Now here on my right, we have a river which the elephants come to every evening to drink. On my left, 20 miles away, are the feeding grounds. And in between, there is nothing left for the elephants to eat. So every day, they come from the water holes, they travel straight out to the feeding areas. The paths are parallel, they will go straight there, they don't deviate, because they know there's nothing here to eat. When they get there, they feed, they come back to the water hole. Now the amount of energy that they get from their food in the feeding areas is less than the amount of energy it takes to get them from the water holes to those feeding areas.
The prime bulls, bigger than the cows and not encumbered with the responsibilities of a young family, can travel much greater distances each day to better pastures, and they often come back to drink.